Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Richard Ireland. I'm the Vice President of Professional Development from SASIOS. I'd like to welcome you all to our Building Trust and Strengthening Accountability with the Enhanced PDPA. It sounds quite a heavy workshop this afternoon, and in many ways it is. This is an incredibly important issue for our industry, for many issues. We really hope that over the course of the next 1.5 hours, it will give you a really good starting point in our journey towards better data management and complying with some of the legislation changes. I'd firstly like to really thank the IMDA for their support and for providing 2 excellent speakers, and of course to Straits Interactive also providing a fantastic speaker. So this afternoon, we're going to do a few things. We're going to have an introduction from Colleen Wee. We're going to then move into a session from Alvin To, and then we're going to have another session from Dominic Ng from IMDA, and then we're going to have a panel. So what are we hoping we can learn from today? Well, I think the first thing is, in our industry, we are in a changed and changing environment. We're collecting more data. We're collecting more sensitive data, and we're having to store it and to utilize it. There are more pressures on us commercially, but at the same time, there's also been some changes to the way the legislation is. So we have a big responsibility to learn, to comply, and really use best practice in the way we manage and store and use data. Definitely there are changes, and we hope over the course of this workshop, you'll be better informed and know the next steps. At the end of this workshop, we will share with you some suggested next steps in your data journey. So I think, let me have an opportunity, if we can just take the next slide, to introduce what we're going to do today. As I said, we'll start with an overview from Colleen Wee from IMDA. And just so I can go to the next slide. Sorry, a little bit about myself. I won't read it out, you can all read it. But certainly data insight is the way forward in our industry and many industries. We can just go into the next slide, please. Our first session, Colleen Wee, Senior Manager, Ecosystem Development, Engagement, Data Innovation Protection Group at IMDA, is a strong advocate of data protection and innovation, will help demystify PDPA, and has experience in public and industry outreach. Over to you, Colleen, and thank you for your time this afternoon.
Right, thank you, Richard. Thank you very much for the short yet very comprehensive opening note as well as updates. Right, very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Colleen from the Data Innovation and Protection Group of IMDA, and thank you for having us this afternoon. So today's topic on data has grown with importance, right, for the mines industry over the past 12 to 18 months. So in addition to the technological advances such as AI automation services, Internet of Things, or the developments that you see with all this advanced technology, as well as the push from COVID-19, right? So we can see that a lot of organizations, including the mine sector, right, actually has frantically kind of shifted, pivoting their business and operating models, as well as the constant adjusting and adapting with the changing needs and demands of meetings and events. So even on this note on all the changing demands and needs, maybe just let me sidetrack a little, right, to add that actually the PDPC has recently updated the advisory on the collection of personal data for COVID-19 contact tracing. So that pertains more for the advisory notes for premise owners as well as employers. So these changes are made in line with the Trace Together Only Safe Entry announcement, right? So of course, we do encourage members and organizations to actually refer to this advisory note on our website. Okay, so back to today's session. with more personal data collected, generated, and used, as what Richard has rightly pointed out, right? So the use and the data actually collected by the mice has actually grown over the years. And this inevitably actually leads to a higher risk and severity of data breaches, right? So all this calls for stronger organizational accountability and good governance over the management of data. So accountability and good data governance lays the foundation to public and consumer trust. All right, it also strengthens an organization resiliency against data breaches, and also, of course, the facilitation of data for innovative purposes. So through today's presentation, you will not only understand the amendments and how these Act amendments actually support greater use of data, but also the demonstration of accountability through the Data Protection Trust Mark and the benefits it provides for businesses. So taking a step back on the Act amendments, we started public consultations since 2017. So the amendment bill is passed in December last year and is progressively taking effect from 1st February this year, right? So this session is actually very timely for us to update members on what are all these changes about. So the amendments itself ensure that we keep pace with the evolving data activities and the changing global trends. So essentially, all these changes helps organizations to strengthen accountability and provide greater support for businesses to better use and manage data confidently. Right, so with that, do allow me to pass the time now to our appointed speaker, Alvin, to share more of all these amendments and updates on the regulatory front of personal data. Right, so over to you, Alvin.
Thanks, Colleen, and good afternoon, everybody. So before I start, there are chat buttons below, right? So key in your questions, and I think they have a poll for you. So do participate in that, and that will help us also tailor in terms of our content and our Q&A later. So type in questions as we go along the way, and no question is too basic, okay, guys? And we will address all of them at the end of this webinar. I'll take about 31 minutes, right, to run through the first part here, which is the enhanced PDPA. If you don't know what that is, put that in the chat as well. No idea what that is? Maybe also you can see, if you don't know how many obligations there are right now, feel free to ask as well, okay? Okay, so the first poll is up. Do you have a DPO in your organization? So let's all key in if you can. All right. So for those of you who don't know what is this is a mandatory role under the law. If you haven't got one, then the highest ranking officer in the company is it. So you haven't got one and you're the boss here today, congratulations. You are the DPO, right? So that's something we'd like to know, and this has been interesting for us as we talk to many firms. Okay, so let's close the poll. Right? What was the result? Okay. Oh, it went away. All right. So 20% plus 20, wait, so 40% no or not sure. All right, thanks for your honesty. So this is something that, as I mentioned, it is mandatory by law, right? And this is something not to be trivialized, okay? Don't worry, we will run through. In fact, later on we'll talk about how do you go about it, right? So, okay, good. I'll start from there, assuming that 40% of you don't know what the DPO is as well. So we will address that question as well, Richard, later on. All right, so let me just start in terms of the enhanced PDPA. Later, we will talk about also what the challenges, and we have another poll later on, okay? So my name is Alvin To. I am the Chief Marketing Officer for a data protection specialist company called Straits Interactive, and we run the Data Protection Excellence Network across the region here, right? And so I'm happy to share with you today the recent amendments to the PDPA, okay? So if you look at the PDPA, right, it was in 2012 and it was enacted at 2014, right? Came into force. And it started with the DNC, and then subsequently the whole data protection regulations came in. And at 2020, there was an amendment to strengthen, right, consumer autonomy and support business, right? So this, we're going to break down into some of the areas that you need to be aware of. Even you've done something already, these 5 amendments, some of them are quite significant, okay? So for those of you, since 40% of you have no idea about DPO, take a piece of pen and a paper, right? What activity will put you under the PDPA? So there are 4-letter words, okay? I'll teach you some. First one is CUDS, cuts. If you do this 4 activity, you will be subjected to the Personal Data Protection Act of Singapore. Or if in other countries, similarly, the Data Protection Act cover these 4 activities. They are C, collect, use, disclose, right? And you store personal data, okay? So I'm sure all of you do that, because being in the mines industry, you will do that. And let's look at the PDPA, right? Customer information comes in, you collect, obviously you use it, and you disclose, right? And many of you are vendors, obviously, so you have disclosed back to your customers. And so personal data, what is personal data? It refers to data about individual that can be identified from the data, or from the data other info the organization has likely to have access. So the second part of the statement is interesting, because some of you do different parts of organization collect different pieces of information of a customer, and you might offer some sort of profiling or data analytics, so you could actually identify from pieces of data of individuals, okay? So that will subject you to the PDPA, right? Now let's look at the data protection provisions. I mentioned earlier on, before February this year, there was 9 obligations. Now there are 11, okay? The 2 new ones on the top left, okay? So the obligations can be categorized into 3 areas, right? On collection side, you have the Trinity, I call them. You need to have a consent, notification, and purpose. So for all of you who are doing any sort of collection, you need to have these 3 settled in the front. And then once it comes in the organization, how do you care for personal data? So there are obligations, there are 4 of them, in terms of accuracy, protection, retention of data, and transfer limitation. Okay. Later we'll talk about enforcements, where some firms fall off out of this, especially being vendors. You know, this part here is very, very important for you. And then the last part, right? Access and correction. That means the citizens or your customers can call you up or write to you and ask for their data, okay, how you used it, how you got it, and how, and you need to reply within a certain amount of time. There is a time clock on you, okay? Now, the 2 new ones are data breach notification and data portability. And I'll go into more detail on this, right? Now, I put a star on data portability is that it probably will come into force end of the year, because there's more details on the regulation. So data breach notification is immediate, okay? So let's look at what is this. Number 1, look at the common exceptions first, okay? Now, the common exceptions in the Data Protection Act, right, prior to this February was, okay, you have exceptions responding to emergency, managing and terminating relationship in employment, okay, publicly available data, evaluation purpose, right? Now, there has been addition in terms of legitimate interest, new exceptions, and business improvement, okay? There have been broadened deemed consent. Deemed consent means you don't have to go and ask again, right? So I'll show you what it means. And revised exceptions, right? These 2 areas in terms of business transaction and research development. Let's go a bit deeper. What is new exception? For the use of personal data without consent for business improvement and legitimate interest, okay? Now, for business improvement, it could be credit card company deriving insights on existing spending habits, okay? So that's for business improvement. Legitimate interest, for the interest of organization or a segment of public. Example, you know, they're hotel skippers, and hotels get together to compile a list of blacklists for these hotel skippers, okay? So that is allowed, right? You needed additional consent for that, right? For pulling this data together. Now, business asset transaction. Previously, it was accorded for sale of asset. Now, it's extended to expand more M&A, sale of share, transferring controlling interest, corporate restructuring, reorganization. Okay, so that's under the business transaction side, and additional exception for research and development. So if you're carrying out additional R&D, they may not have immediate application to your product, right? So your labs, your research consultant to do market research, right? So those are allowed, okay? Deemed consent. So this would be, well, I think in this current space, most of us now have vendors who are sending stuff, you know, you're going online, you're doing digitalization. So this allows the multiple layers outsourcing to facilitate data sharing, right? Because now we have a lot more vendors and we are now remote and all that. So online retailers disclosing PD, right, personal data to logistic partners for fulfillment. That's allowed. You don't need to have additional consent. It's part of deemed consent, okay, right? And use and disclose of personal data for secondary purpose. Okay, so this will be sharing of preferences and reviews with travel website to develop packages, right? So this is something that you can use, okay? So I think that's within the market for travel, yeah? So data portability. What is this data portability? You already have experienced it. If you have changed phone number or phone within telcos, you will have the number portability. Similar concept, right? The whole point is to give consumer autonomy to enable you to request a copy of data to move from one service provider to another. Today, if you change, you know, from M1 to Singtel, right? They ask you for consent and the data is transferred across, and straight away you have number portability. So the whole point is that your personal data travels more easily, right? So there's no blockage and nobody can hold you ransom to a service provider. Okay, it's covered for electronic data. Paper is not covered at this point in time. Transactional data is covered, okay, for your purchase history, booking history. What's not covered is the derived business intelligence, right? So it's not obligated for a transfer on the other side, or access similar to access obligation, okay? So that is the data portability. Now, subject to it having more details by end of the year, so this will be enacted when the regulations are issued, okay? But it is the 11th obligation. DNC, this was the first enforcement of our PDPA that saw a lot of complaints to the PDPC, the commission, right? So now it's expanded as well, okay? So you look at the red ones. And number one, the use of numbers through dictionary attacks or address harvesting. You might have gotten calls, people, you ask them how do you get a number. Oh yeah, we just have a random generator. No longer allowed, okay? So you can't have any of these excuses right now. Okay, so that's one. The other thing, you must check do not call. If any of you are doing any sort of outbound marketing for your clients, please remember you need to check the do not call, and now it's 21 days validity. That means what you check today is valid for 21 days. Subsequently, you need to check it again. Okay, and the principle is that you can delegate the task, but you can't delegate the responsibility, right? So if you are getting some other parties to do it for you, responsibility still comes back to you, and you make sure you duty the particular vendor. And you know, you all can ask me later on. We have seen a number of cases where you know, the vendor did not have a robust process and then got implicated, were enforced. Okay, so DNC is a hot topic because it's in the public's eye, right? And then messages sent without the use of phone numbers. Yes, last time people were splitting hairs. Hey, you know, voice, text, and fax. Okay, so is WhatsApp text? It's not really SMS, right? Now they said, oh, hang on, IM, instant messaging is covered. Okay, so please, guys, you know, if you're going to be sending messages via any sort of this IM, it is covered under the Spam Control Act, right? Now, there is the exceptions for what is a specified message and what is not. Okay, so if you take an example on the left side, a specified message, the do not call covers message of promotional activity like this, all right, a specified message. So you're selling something to an individual. But on the right side, if it's solely to promote employment or if it's B2B, right, then that's not a specified message, and that's exempted under the DNC, right? So B2B, okay, or something like an employment opportunity or notification is not under the do not call, right? Now, under the PDP and the government, some of you may ask, you know, is it the same? the government has its own Public Sector Governance Act, okay, but it's subjected to the do not call if they make any calls. The private sector have the PDPA and the do not call, but it also has your own relevant sectorial regulation. So usually if you have a sectorial regulation that has more prescribed measures, that then overtakes the PDPA, but they are never in conflict. Okay, so with this, even though the government is under the Public Sector Governance Act, they have issued that all vendors working with the government needs to be PDPA compliant. Okay, Dominic will speak to that afterwards. And we have seen many firms who come to us for consulting have seen that they have been put under due diligence whether they comply or not in tenders. And some of them been asked if you have plans for the trust mark, because that is the gold standard for due diligence of a company's soundness in data protection practice. Something you want to take note of. Okay, so next I'm going to move on to shift to accountability in data governance. Okay, so compliance accountability, right? If you go to the PDPC today, there are guides and frameworks. Okay, these things are available in the PDPC website. But what they moved on from guides and frameworks is that now to standards. There's trust marks, right? Both for local in Singapore and for cross-border, which Dominic will talk about, these two level certifications. And recently, we have enhanced the PDPA to strengthen organizational accountability, right, towards management data, right? Also, in view of the innovative use of data, given all the digitalization happening, and for greater consumer autonomy. So let's look through the life cycle, right? Collect, use, disclose, and store I mentioned earlier on. So there are three things you want to be aware of. The 40% of you who don't have a DPO, these three things you need to have, okay? Policy, people, right? DPO minimally. In fact, you should have a committee involved. And processes that meet the data protection requirements, right? So the roadmap, right, for data protection is quite rich. It's not just you come in and do DPO. And for some of you who are professionals in the group here, there is number of skill sets that can be added on, right? For you to look at data protection management is the base, right? Business risk management, cyber data breach incident management, stakeholder management, audit and compliance, data governance, right? And on the right side, data ethics, data sharing, design thinking. Okay, so these are all mapped to also training available, which we at Data Protection Excellence Network have. So yeah, later I can answer more questions if you're interested. But again, if you look at this, is a step of the augmented skills of a professional data protection person. Okay, so it's not just doing data protection management alone. There are other augmented skills needed because you have digitalization, you have now AI and all that, right? Okay, now let's look at data breach management. Earlier on I mentioned, right, that was the 10th obligation. So what is it that you need? This is thing called a data breach management plan, right? For the 40% of you who have DPO, do you have one? Something like that. Okay, so you need to prepare and respond. So the important thing is that this particular data breach notification obligation has a clock on you. You have 3 calendar days. Okay, so before that you need to have a plan. How on earth are you going to handle this, right? Prepare, and then when incident happens, this is the framework recommended care, right? Contain, assess, report, and evaluate. So I'll run through it quickly for you. So when an incident happens, okay, straight away you need to look at how do you contain the breach, right? Taking immediate steps to limit harm. So guys, the principle of handling data breach is number 1, prevention or limiting of harm. Okay, so containing is number 1, right? And then assess the risks. Okay, so you assess what is the data exposed, what is the risk to the individuals affected. Okay, assessment needs to be carried out within 30 days. I mean, detailed assessments. But if you already determine that you have a data breach and involve personal data of significant impact and of certain size, you need to notify, which I'll go through in a minute. Yeah. So reporting. Okay. So after you've assessed the risk, that's the next decision point. Do I need to report it on 2 fronts? one to the regulator, okay, one to the individuals, right? So you need to notify to PDPC within 3 calendar days, not 3 business days, 3 calendar days, okay? Right? If you have data breach that is of significant harm and of significant size, okay? So later I'll give you a summary, right? And that means you actually need to have a plan to do it firstly to the regulator within 3 days, and then to your notify to the affected individuals if it's a significant data breach. And last one, of course, evaluate post event, right? What could have been taken and review of the incident to prevent data breaches. So what is this trigger? If your data breach can result in significant harm, what would data would constitute significant harm? Medical data, financial data, right? So that will be sensitive data that can be of use or misuse. Or is of significant scale. You have 500 records or onwards affected, spreadsheet that's exposed and all that, right? Or downloaded data. This you have to notify. The only exception is that, let's say somebody lost a thumb drive, it was well encrypted and all that, and all your data in there is already encrypted. Then okay, then you can justify that you may take exceptions not to notify the individuals because the chances of exposure is low. But again, you need to tell the PDPC if it meets these two or meets this size, right? And then say, okay, I may not notify the individuals based on this exception, okay? But in consultation with the regulators, right? So these are the examples, right? First name, last name. IC is considered sensitive, right? Okay. So I'm sure many of you do now collect IC because of the travel history of the COVID measures. So I think by nature of running events, you have to collect personal data of very sensitive nature like that. Okay. So account information, so these things, biometric, right? Many of you are now taking on, facial recognition maybe, or maybe, taking on temperatures and stuff like that. Okay. So just be aware, the COVID has also put more data or more personal data of sensitive nature in your hands. Hence, responsibility has gone up for the MICE industry as well. Okay, so Trustmark, I'll leave Dominic to explain more about this, but this is a very hot topic in the industry right now, and it is the gold standard in Singapore, right? For multinational to measure themselves and also to measure the vendors, right? Government, same thing, right? So I'll let Dominic elaborate on that. Let's talk about enforcement. Okay, the accountability and enforcement. First, our regulator, PDPC, okay, takes a investigation process like that. Yeah? Okay, so is personal data involved, right? Okay, and if not, then it doesn't involve a breach of DPA obligations. So you could have, loss of your commercial data on that, then PDPC may not be involved. But if it has personal data, then you can take this route, right? You can either go to PDPC, okay, facilitation, or alternative dispute resolution, okay, or go to sectoral regulators. So for example, if you are, for MICE industry, you may not be in regulated, but for some of them who are in health and medical, or maybe you're working with those guys, right? You outsource party for those, then you want to be very aware of this route, okay? And then there is this path here, right? PDPC, whether you take expedited or voluntary undertaking. What does that mean? A typical investigation right now takes about 18 months and it's very draining, right? On both parties, the regulator and the company. So what our regulator has done is that, okay, if we can cut it down from 18 months, right, down to 2 or 4 months or 2 to 5 months, all right, and that's business, pro-business. But in return, what do you need to do? First one, if you do a voluntary undertaking, okay, means you actually can show that you're an accountable firm, and by way of being audited against the standard, which is the Trustmark, then they can take that in lieu of investigation of a data breach. Okay, that means you show that you're an accountable firm, you're going to act and remediate according to the processes already in your Trustmark declared practice, right? Okay, so then that can be taken into account. Or you admit, right, do expedited breach decision. Okay, so for 40% of you have no DPO, then you have to go this route, right? Or poor governance. So then they will shorten the thing all right? And you take that in light of how they will enforce and penalties, right? But if you say no, 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 and then you try to do a dance around, then you could be dragged for the full investigation, and at that point in time, the full brunt of the law will be on you. Okay, so something to be aware of, right? Our regulator is trying to reward companies to come clean, to be accountable. Okay, so this is something that they are encouraging, right? To be accountable as a firm. Best if you actually can be accountable that's audited against a standard. Okay, so that's the incentivized accountable practice. Now, this is interesting, in terms of those of you who are MDs or CEOs here. Okay, what are the penalties? The deterrence. You know that our highest fine so far is 1 million, right? Against the Sing Health. Now it has gone up to 10% of your annual turnover. Okay, read that properly, guys. 10% of your annual turnover. That could be the max. Individuals, this is new as well, okay, can be taken to task to be fined 5,000 or imprisonment of 2 years if you are found for egregious mishandling. What's that? That means you are reckless, knowingly disclosing PD, right? You go and sell the database, or you do something else with the data that was you have access to, right? The use for gain of harm to another person, okay? And you've seen some cases where somebody do a favor somebody else, trying to get the data because they wanted to know which this person is in the database. Or if you are doing any sort of data manipulation and you re-identify what is supposed to be anonymized data and make that known. Guys, this one is newer, and so therefore they can go after the individual. Previously, if an employee did something, then it's as if the company did it. But now if it's found an employee did it as an egregious mishandling, PDPA enforce on the individual itself, and maybe the company too, right? Okay. On the do not call side, previously it was up to 1 million, now it's 5% of your annual turnover. So if you are doing any outbound marketing or that, and you really infringe, then they will come after you, and the fine has gone up, right? Because this DNC thing, I think with the COVID, a lot of us are getting probably all kind of funny calls and messages, right? Some of them are really sounding very professional, very convincing. And now the do not call is meant to block all these things. So if you are found to be not complying to that, the fine is going up as well. So I want to let you know these things are in the pipeline. It will be enforced next year, right? Okay, 2022. Now let's look at incidents. It's on the rise, okay? From 2019, you look at from 2018, it jumped almost double. Then 2020, 54. 2021, 9 at the moment, okay? There are a lot more in the pipeline. Now, some of you may ask, I think, Richard, you're asking me, so how much of my industry guys or my industry are involved in this? So let me just share with you what we saw in terms of industry. This is the 2019 data. Okay, we did a study last year. So I just read out the thing, right? Okay, these are the top 5 industry: financial, F&B, non-profit, professional services, retail. Some of you may fall into some of these services. Professional services, you might be there. Okay, you might be in F&B, or you might be in travel and leisure. Okay, so look at the percentages here. The point to make also is that the non-profit is also within the top 5, right? So no industry is spared from the data protection enforcement. Okay, it doesn't matter you're one-man show, a 10-man show, 1,000-man show, profit, non-profit. Okay, so be very aware. If you haven't got your act or house in order, you really have no more excuse left, because you see the enforcements, right? This is 2 years ago, right? And let's look at the percentages. Which are the obligations that were most enforced on? So 64% was on protection obligation. A one-liner protection obligation is that all personal data under your care must be reasonably protected. What is reasonably? Depending on your industry and your company, okay? But it needs to be reasonably protected, right? Second one, accountability obligation. That's 40% of you. Accountability obligation means you need to have somebody accountable for your data protection and have policy in place. No DPO is an immediate breach of the accountability obligation. No PDPA policy on your website, immediate red flag. Okay. 12. is in notification and consent obligation. Right, Richard, and we were talking about earlier on, you know, as vendors to companies, how do we manage the data that is given or you're collecting? If you don't know this consent notification obligation and you actually trip yourself up with the customers, 12% of the cases were in this space. Let me just go through the 6 common data breaches for SMEs, okay, from the cases you've seen. First, no or untrained DPO. So even some of you who, you know, the 60% of you who have DPO, is the DPO trained, right? Second one is staff not trained DP in data protection. Now, the investigators are not only satisfied whether you have a DPO, they will go interview your staff and ask them, do you know about this process and all that, okay? And if they say, no, I received an email 3 years ago, data protection is very important, subsequently nothing happened, then they know they're not trained, okay? A recent enforcement case where a particular high-flying director of a financial services company breached the practice and caused an investigation. And during investigation, the investigator asked the DPO, you said that this guy, you know, you guys have trained people on this thing and that thing, and he actually breached your internal SOP. Can you show me when you did the training? And can you show me which part of your training covered this exact portion we told him? So the DPO had to show the records, right? When the training was being done, this guy was not present when he's invited. And the training slides, which part of it was being covered on the particular area where he was told not to do. Okay? So it's not just that you got DPO, you know, I told my guys data protection is important. Insufficient. Second, tranche is non-compliant vendors. So many of you here are both sides, right? You're a vendor to other people, or you may have vendors under you. Have you, number one, as a vendor, the requisite evidence to provide when you're being duty, right? Okay. Do you comply with the PDPA? Okay, Richard, I think later can speak to it as a multinational firm, right? The due diligence you've seen, or you are also contracting vendors. We are seeing now in tenders, right, or contracts being worded in, do you comply with PDPA, and please show us evidence, okay? So, and do you actually have audited evidence, for example, like a trust mark or ISO? Okay, so non-compliant vendors was one of the big trip up for firms. No principle applied to processes. 2020 have seen a huge digitalization. I'm not sure how many of you look at the data protection implications for like work from home, you know, all the digital process you put in place, apps you've launched, okay? Weak security, right? So work from home is one big area, right? Data is flying around to the edge now, and it's flying onto devices. So this is something to be aware of. And no clear incident handling. I told you the 10th obligation, 3 calendar days. Do you have the process to escalate that? To help you guys, so you might want to take a camera and, you know, point at this QR code. Okay, so there's a guide from the PDPC that's useful. And then there's this link here later. I think when we send you the slides, probably you can click that. But if not, just take a picture of this slide right now. Okay, screenshot it. All right, let's look at the consideration for organizations. How do you get started? On the left side, this part here, I'm not sure you can see it. So maybe I just zoom in for you. This part here, CEO, CFO, COO, DPO. Some of you may want to interpret that as a pay scale. But if it's actually the level of a DPO you need to appoint. It's not a junior person, it's a management person, okay? And appoint a data protection officer is mandatory, and this thing appeared in the newspapers. You can't tell PDPC you don't know because they publish in Straits Times, Business Times, right? So this is something that was in the papers for quite a number of sessions in the last few years, okay? So you need to appoint a DPO, right? And register the DPO with the ACRA BizFile. I think right now you probably have gotten the notice, okay? Next. After the DPO, look at, review your processes, okay? Let me just unzoom. Okay. Let me see. Okay, sorry guys, you're stuck for a while. All right, so take stock of your organization's inventory. If you don't know what that is, later we'll talk about resources you can do. But you want to go and take stock of what is this personal data you have, right? And the processes you have. PDPC do have a quick tool for you to look at that, right? And you have advisory guidelines and infographics that are helpful just for you to get started, okay? And I think Sasios has some other things for you put in place later for you. So get help, guys, right? So this is something that not to be still sitting around, because PDPA has been enforced since 2014, and with the new enhanced PDPA, you can see the fines gone up, obligations have gone up, and enforcement have gone up. Okay, and now the standards of and accountability is also enforced, right? So there are things called data protection as a service, right? And this is something for SME. You may want to take advantage of that. As a company, we do that as well. So we are listed on the PDPC website, and you want in the Q&A, you can ask questions about it, right? Essentially is to help SME to go through to set up a simple data protection management program to show accountability for their own data protection practices. Okay, so this is something that is also has funding, so you want to really get this going and appoint a DPO or get your DPO trained. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna end here. So if you want to have any contact, yeah, I can take a snapshot. This is fine. If not, we'll Q&A later on. Okay, and we will love your feedback. PDPC has this, so please take again a picture of this, right? You have it, right? Open up your form, so then you can key in as you go along, right? So snap a picture of this, right? And I thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague from IMDA, Dominic, to talk about the trust mark.
Thanks, Alvin. Wow, that was incredibly informative, and there's lots for us all to follow up on. You'll be coming back and joining me in a panel after we hear from Dominic. So just a little bit about Dominic. He's the manager of the Certification Data Innovation Protection Group Infocom Media Development Authority. He's part of the Data Protection Certification Team, Certified Information Privacy Manager, many years of experience working closely with the MICE sector. And on that note, Dominic, over to you, and welcome this afternoon.
All right, thanks, Richard. Okay, the golden question that I have to ask everyone is, can you see my slides? No. Yes, sorry. Always have this. Yes, okay, great. All right, yep, everyone should be able to see my slides. And thank you so much, Richard. And once again, thank you, Sasios, for having us today. It's my privilege to speak to everybody. My name is Dominic, as Richard has rightly pointed out. I'm from the IMDA Data Protection Certification Team. And in IMDA, we administer 3 data protection certifications. The IMDA Data Protection Trust Mark, which Alvin has spoke about earlier on, as well as 2 other certifications, Apec Cross-Border Privacy Rules, as well as the Apec Privacy Recognition for Processors. Okay, so I won't go into the details on why IMDA came out with the data protection certifications. Again, Alvin has painted a great picture of the importance of data protection in Singapore. Okay, I'd just like to touch very briefly on 4 points that was really the genesis of the thinking behind the development of a data protection trust mark. Okay, so first of all, consumers are increasingly demanding for more privacy, and this is something that it's becoming more and more normalized. The trend where consumers are more educated, they are aware of their privacy rights, and they will not hesitate, okay, to inform the PDPC if they sense that an organization is not treating their personal data with respect. Number 2, digitalization leading to data overload. The very fact that we're having this session online, okay, via Zoom, is a testament of where we're heading in terms of the future of work, businesses, how we do business. And as we digitalize, as organizations digitalize, there would be a collection, an increase, a surge in the collection of personal data. And as we all know, the more personal data that is held by you, it becomes a little bit dangerous sometimes, right? I mean, you know, it's there waiting for, it could potentially be there, you know, somebody could come and steal that data, there could be a data breach. And thirdly, increasing number of data breaches. Alvin has pointed out the statistics, so I won't go into this. At the end of the day, it's not a question of if, but when for many organizations. Okay, so I do talk to some of the organizations undergoing certifications, and some of them they have encountered data breaches before, and they shared that, they never thought that would happen to them, and then alas, it has happened to them. So it's the kind of thinking that it is really not if but when. And last but not least, we are also encouraging organizations to see data privacy, data protection as a business differentiator, especially now in the digital economy, as we are going global and all that, that it is something not just seen from a compliance point of view, but seen as a way for businesses to set themselves apart from the competitors. And if you're SME here today, this is really one area that you can punch above your weight, not just in Singapore, but internationally as well. So yes, that little thinking there. Okay, so for today's presentation, I will be talking a little bit more on the Data Protection Trust Mark. I will share very briefly on the Apec CBPR PRP as well, just for information. Okay, so for the Trust Mark, it is a domestic certification currently recognized only in Singapore. Okay, currently, that keyword here is as of now. Okay, it was launched in January 2019, and for the Apec CBPR PRP, they are certifications. They are system certifications developed by the Apec Secretariat, and it is based on the Apec Privacy Framework. Okay, and this CBPR PRP would make a lot of sense to you if your organization does a lot of cross-border transfer of personal data, especially within the Apec region. And it is launched in 17 July 2019. So both certifications are relatively new in Singapore. So let me jump straight into the Data Protection Trust Mark. What is this about? Okay, so the Data Protection Trust Mark certification, the aim of it is straightforward. We want to establish and recognize robust data governance standards to help business increase their competitive advantage and build trust with their clients. 4 key objectives. Number 1, strengthen compliance. Yes, that is important. But more importantly, it is to encourage accountability by organizations. Number 2, provide a competitive advantage for business. And number 3, boost your consumers' confidence in how you manage their personal data. And last but not least, to enhance and promote consistency in data protection standards across sectors. This is important because in Singapore, what we are trying to aspire, or rather the Trust Mark to aspire to, is that at the end of the day, if you are Trust Mark certified organization, then you would have that reputation that you have robust data protection standards and practices in place. You can be trusted. You're a trusted organization. So now the Data Protection Trust Mark, it is an enterprise-wide certification, valid for 3 years. And we look at your data protection policies, your processes, and your practices. As of today, we have certified a total of 52 organizations. So naturally, your eyes will gravitate to the big names, right? AIG, DBS, for example, M1, StarHub. Yeah, we do have the big boys, but we also have quite a few SMEs as well. In fact, majority of our certified companies come from SME sector as well as the non-profit sector. Because as long as you are a private entity in Singapore, then the Data Protection Trust Mark will make a lot of sense to your organization. We do have some companies, certified companies in the MICE industry. So we have names like, let me see, where are you? Oh, yeah, okay, I mean, Triangular is one of them, definitely. We do have companies like, Pico right here, yes, Pico is here. Xperia Events. So these are some companies from the MICE industry who saw the importance of having a Data Protection Trust Mark, and they came forward for certification as a demonstration of accountability, not only to their clients, not only to their business partners, but also to the regulators as well. Okay, the Data Protection Trust Mark was developed based on the PDPA, so the Data Protection Obligations. Currently, as of now, there's 10, okay, because the 11th one is not enforced yet. And but we took it further. We incorporated elements from international benchmarks and best practices. So the Trust Mark requirements, there are some elements taken from the Australian law, the Australian privacy law, the Hong Kong privacy law, as well as the EU GDPR. and international benchmarks like OECD guidelines and the Apec privacy framework, including the CBPR-PRP, to come up with 4 key principles of Singapore's data protection certification framework. Okay, and they are, very briefly, number 1, okay, so 4 of them. Number 1, governance and transparency. So we look at whether an organization has the appropriate data protection policies and practices implemented. For example, do you conduct risk assessment? Okay, do you do a data protection impact assessment to make sure that you identify processes that collect personal data that are there's high risk involved? Do you have a data breach management plan? Okay, this is very important. And all these policies, whether you have them in place, whether are they implemented, and importantly, whether these policies and practices, they are communicated to your stakeholders. Number 2, we look at management of personal data, whether the organization has in place appropriate consent mechanism, for example, to collect personal data from consumers. Do you have the consent to use and disclose personal data for the appropriate purposes notified to individuals? So now we've looked at governance and transparency. We look at the management of personal data. What we look at is care of personal data. What do you do with the personal data that you're holding on to? So as part of the Trustmark assessment, we will look at whether the organization ensures that there are appropriate information security in place. Policies governing, for example, Infocom security, or whether your organization has a retention policy that dictates how long can you hold on to personal data. And when there is no reason for you to hold on to the personal data, do you have a policy to ensure that the personal data is properly disposed? And at the end of the day, do you also ensure that the data that you have, is it accurate, is it complete? Okay, so this is care of personal data. And last but not least, we look at individuals' rights, whether the organization provides for the withdrawal of consent, whether you allow your clients to access and correct their personal data. If, for example, they would like to update the information, name change, they moved, changed address, etc. Okay, so the next question, after I've spoken about what exactly is the data protection trust, but the next question is, why would me, an organization, why would an organization put myself through the rigors of a certification? Okay, this is a certification, somewhat similar like an ISO certification. So we've asked our certified companies, okay, why did you want to go for Trustmark certification? Okay, and these are the 5 broad categories that they have feedback. They have provided that, hey, this has helped them. So number 1, all of my certified companies would agree that the biggest benefit to them as an organization is that it provides assurance to them. What do I mean by that? The Data Protection Trustmark, it is a third-party certification, okay, and the requirements are based, or rather designed by the PDPC and the IMDA. So IMDA, we sent out the PDPC to develop the requirements. So these requirements are developed by the regulators, not by some third-party private entity. And going through the certification assessment would help improve your overall data governance, will help you to identify gaps, areas for improvement. Okay, so during the certification, if there are gaps identified, areas for improvement identified, it is not immediate failure. The assessors will point it out to you as an organization and allow you the chance to remediate, to improve yourself. Okay. Number 2, it raises business competitiveness. We have a true story. TRS Forensics, if you were to see the logo here, the small SME in the field of data forensics, they were invited to bid for a contract by MNC based in the EU. So you know how EU, they are very strict in terms of the GDPR and all that. So they invited TRS Forensics, Singapore SME, less than 20 packs at that point of time, to bid for this contract. And they secured this contract. So TRS was very surprised, okay, and they approached the legal counsel of this MNC, and they asked, of all the international competitors and other vendors, why did you choose us? And so this MNC replied that, while yes, there are people of similar caliber, organizations of similar caliber and pricing, but we noticed that you have a data protection Trustmark certification. Okay, and I mentioned earlier on that the Trustmark, the DPTM, is currently only recognized in Singapore, but it is a mark of accountability. No matter where you go, regardless of whether it's recognized, it is a mark of accountability. And this MNC told TRS Forensics that because of this, because you have the certification, we know that you are accountable, can be trusted, and therefore we decide to go with you. So this is a true story. You can read it later. We do have some Marcom's material which you can refer to. Number 3, strengthens customers' trust. All of us would agree, trust is something that takes years and a lot of effort to build up, but all it takes is one incident to bring it down. In fact, a lot of companies, they mention that in the event of a data breach, they do not fear the financial penalty, frankly. Financial penalty is one thing, but they're saying that if I can just pay off the trouble, then it's not really a big issue. But what they fear is a reputational fallout from a data breach. Once you encounter a data breach, your name will appear in the newspapers, and then some incidents, international cases where the stock market immediately reacts, and then the stocks drop by quite a bit. And so all these things are really afraid of is really the reputational fallout. Number 4, demonstrate accountability to regulators, not just in Singapore, but around the world. Having a trust mark, some kind of data protection certification like the trust mark is a demonstration of accountability. In Singapore, the PDPC has published in their act, in the Guide to Active Enforcement. The Guide to Active Enforcement published 2 years ago, where they mentioned that organizations that are trust mark certified, and if you encounter a data breach, you may be offered or you may request what we call option of undertaking. For you are familiar with the legal term, undertaking basically means that if you encounter data breach, there will be an opportunity for you given to you to put in place your data breach management plan, to kick off your remediation plans, to ensure that you plug the gaps, you resolve the situation, and if you can do it within the timeline, and PDPC is satisfied, this will be done in lieu of an investigation. So this is really a big thing for many organizations. And last but not least, the trust mark. It helps organizations increase overseas market access. Why? Because the data protection trust mark is administered by IMDA. So we are technically the government of Singapore. And with the reputation, trust mark brings along the reputation, the Singapore government's reputation, stringent quality control, rule of law, and it helps to provide assurance to overseas consumers, regulators, and business partners that a certified company, certified under a data protection trust mark, can be trusted. And last year, there was a survey conducted where we found that 4 in 5 consumers believe that companies that handle personal data should be trust mark certified. And 3 in 4 consumers said that they would prefer to purchase from, and they're more willing to share personal data with trust mark certified companies. So this is a B2C. From a B2B perspective, 7 in 10 companies said that, no, I prefer to do business with a trust mark certified companies for the very simple reason. Why? Because under the PDPA, if you are a company that engages a vendor and your vendor screws up, your vendor encounters a data breach, you cannot absolve liability. You cannot say that, oh, it's my vendor's fault. It has nothing to do with me as an organization. Unfortunately, your company, if such a thing happened, your organization, there will be some degree of liability as well. And because of that, a lot of companies say that, hey, I'd rather deal with somebody that I can trust. And therefore, 7 in 10 companies say that, yes, I prefer to do business with a trust mark certified company. And 2 in 3 companies, for this reason, say that they're keen to apply for the data protection trust mark. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to very briefly talk about the Apec CBPR, PRP, just for your interest and information's sake. So all of us are familiar with Apec. So in fact, Apec, in terms of GDP and population, we are even bigger than the EU. Because there's just so many economies, 21 economies, you have the big players, you have the United States, and then you have the People's Republic of China, you have Russia, the Russian Federation, and all that, as part of this Apec, this Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. So there's a little bit of a problem here because, again, in a digital economy, ability to transfer information across border is a fundamental tool for business in the global digital economy. And therefore, Apec sat down and said that, hey, many different economies, different privacy laws and all that. Why don't we come up with something like in a way, like a system, a certification, to help Apec economies to bridge different privacy laws, to reduce barriers and to build consumer, business, and regulator trust in cross-border flow of personal information. So there are 2 types, CBPR and PRP, under the Apec certifications, which IMDA were administering. The first one, CBPR, this makes sense to you if you are what we call a data controller, a company that collects, uses, disclose personal data, and you do a lot of cross-border transfer of data, especially within the Apec region. So the CBPR is based on the 9 privacy principles of the Apec privacy framework. Okay, and there are currently, of the 21 economies, 9 are participating in this CBPR system. Okay, so 9 out of 21, of course, this number we are hoping that it would increase. But 9 out of these 21 saying that yes, we are keen to start certifying companies in our own jurisdiction with the CBPR to allow them to enjoy the benefits. Okay, so for the PRP, this is designed for data processors. Simply put it, okay, I mean, under the PDPA, we call it data intermediaries. That's another name for it. But if you're a DP, okay, you're in the business of processing personal data on behalf of your clients, like a third-party vendor, then the PRP will make sense to you because it demonstrates your data controllers that you are able to meet the 2 required principles under the Apec privacy framework, which is the security, safeguards, and accountability. Okay, so the difference between the Apec CBPR and PRP and the Data Protection Trust Mark is that the Data Protection Trust Mark, it is enterprise-wide, right? We look at the entire organization's privacy policies and all that. For the CBPR, it is specific. There is a specific scope done where we look at the specific data that has been transferred overseas and the systems and the policies surrounding that transfer of that personal data. And unfortunately, the certification is valid for 1 year. But again, this is something that we have spoken to Apec to see how can we increase. But as of now, it is for 1 year versus a trust mark, which is for 3 years. Yep. So benefits for business for CBPR, PRP. I won't go into this because it is quite the same, quite similar to this trust mark. But I'd like to say that for the trust mark, yes, it is a domestic certification, helpful in terms of giving you, putting you in a strong position to comply with PDPA. For CBPRP, is more international, especially in the APEC region, and there are countries, for example, Japan. Okay, Japan, it's a very big thing to the Japanese, the CBPR certification. And I've heard of stories where Japanese firms, when they engage international vendors, the CBPR is a requirement. So if you are a company, okay, and your focus is, for example, in the Japanese market, then this CBPR will be a big advantage to you. In fact, Singapore, we recognize the Apec CBPR and PRP under our PDPA as a legitimate transfer mechanism. Okay, so meaning that at the end of the day, there are certain things that you need to meet in order to transfer data overseas or to receive data, personal data from an overseas organization. And we recognize the CBPR PRP certification as one way for organizations to legally send out to transfer personal data across border, and similarly to receive personal data. Okay, so this is a little bit complex, and if you're interested, please feel free to read up more. So I can't really talk about this in just one presentation slot. Okay, very briefly, okay, certification process. Organizations who are certified, who are interested to be certified, you apply online. Okay, so right here, step 1, apply online, make payment. I'll talk about the cost later. Once you have applied, you will receive, once you've applied and received an approval for IMDA, you will receive a self-assessment form for you to fill up. And then with the self-assessment form that you are supposed to fill up, you will need to engage what we call an assessment body. So these assessment bodies are third-party assessors appointed by IMDA. So they are right here, 5 of them. You may choose which one you're most comfortable with, which one that can provide you with a more competitive pricing. Once you have your assessment body and your self-assessment form, what happens next is that you will do an assessment, documentation review, where you look at your data protection policies and all that. After that, there will be an on-site assessment where the assessors will come down just to make sure that whatever is in your policies we practice on the ground. During the assessment, if there's any gaps, any areas for improvement, you'll be allowed the chance for remediation. And once the remediation is completed, okay, the assessment is completed, the assessment body submits a report to IMDA with a recommendation, okay, whether the organization has met the requirements. And if we agree with the recommendations after our review, then you will be certified with the Data Protection Trust Mark. Same process for CBPR as well. Okay, so cost. Okay, very briefly again, cost. There is an application fee of $535, okay, payable to IMDA. To encourage organizations who may be interested to take on multiple certifications, a little bit more bandwidth. There's a single application fee for multiple certifications. And if you are SME, okay, good news is, or rather, well, it's a short timeline, I apologize for that, but we have waived off the application fee for SMEs for CBPR and PRP until the end of this month. For the assessment fee payable to the assessment body, this is something that it's hard to set a range here, okay? But on average, the cost for a typical SME averages about $5,000, about there. Yep. To get a better idea of the price range for an assessment fee, you will have our advice is talk to one of the assessment body to ask for a non-obligatory quote. Okay, because the pricing would largely depend on things like your annual turnover, for example, complexity of organization, the amount of personal data held in your functions, etc. And then the next question after this is, are there any funding available for organizations? Yes, there are. Organizations interested with funding support can approach Enterprise Singapore to tap on enterprise development grant. So there's eligibility criteria here. That as long as you meet the eligibility criteria, you can approach Enterprise Singapore and to tap on the enterprise development grant. And of course, again, if your organization is keen on multiple certifications with the Trustmark CBPR, you can put up an integrated application, an assessment process for funding as well as during the certification itself, because both certifications are very similar in terms of what they look out for. So, you know, if you're going to go for Trustmark as well as CBPR, might as well do it together. There could be some potential cost saving and effort saving as well, rather than going for them individually. Okay, this is my last slide. Thank you so much. I apologize that I overran a little bit, but for more information, feel free to visit our website. You can also click on our link to take a look at our success stories that have compiled with certified companies. Because if you're certified, what we do is that we will work with you in terms of marcoms to profile your organization as well as to get the word out, saying that, you know, this organization has been Trustmark certified, they take data protection very seriously, and just to build up your reputation as well. And feel free to give me a call, drop me an email. Happy to have a conversation with you on the Trustmark certifications, as well as the CBPR. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dominic. You're going to be joining me and Alvin in a moment for in our panel, but I'm just going to do a quick poll before we go into the panel. So just bear with me. Okay, that's okay. That's not the one. So I'm going to relaunch. So if you put your answer in, if you don't mind. Okay, okay. So what is the main challenge in implementing data protection program and compliance in your organization? Is it budget? Is it resource? Or is it time? Okay, not everyone's going to vote, but resource. 52% of you said it's resource, followed by budget, and then the last one about time. So that's interesting. We'll come back to that. So if I could now invite Dominic and Alvin back to the screen, and we will start our panel now. Well, where do we start? There's so much to cover. Although I must say, the slides that both of you have prepared are incredibly informative. And one of the first questions that's asked is, will they be made available? And the answer is yes. So that's the first great question. So should we start on the challenge side or the opportunity side? Let's start on the challenge side, you know, the fear side. So I suppose one of the, just to reiterate a couple of points. If there's no DPO, it's the CEO's responsibility. Alvin, correct?
Highest ranking officer.
Highest ranking officer, okay. And just to confirm, we did say 10% of turnover if there are breaches, correct? Up to 10%.
Yeah, by next year. So yes, that is for the fines here.
Right. Okay. Well, I think maybe we should have put that as part of our polling, because that's a pretty strong incentive, if nothing else, for all of us to get quite serious. So a couple of things I wanted just to talk about. Sorry, Alvin?
I said that's even higher than your GDPR 4% of global revenue. It is 10% of your annual revenue.
Right. So let's just start straight away. Please feel free to put it into the chat function or to the Q&A. I can look at both. But this is a good question, and it's, is the data protection trust mark the same as the US trust ARC? Okay. And I'll have a follow-up question if that's okay.
Yep. Just to briefly address this, for trust ARC, I believe they are talking about an organization here. So trust ARC will be similar like an IMDA, for example. And if I'm not wrong, trust ARC is a private entity. So for in this case, then of course the fundamental difference is that of course Trustmark is a certification, and then US Trust they are a private entity. But what I'm aware is that they administer the CBPR as well. They are one of the accountability agents that is recognized by the Apec Secretariat. So just for information, I mean, since it's on this question, the Apec system certification is not administered by a single country. It is administered by the whole Apec or Apec Secretariat. And what happens is that countries who are then interested to participate in the CBPR will then, of course, have to submit the intention to participate. Intention. I can't remember the exact official term to that. But the signal your intention to participate. And then once you have signal your intention to participate, you will have to identify what we call an accountability agent. So this accountability agent is basically your certification body. And in Singapore's case, IMDA, we are the recognized accountability agent that is authorized to administer the CBPR PRP certification. So for other countries, there are many other different accountability agents. So for example, in Japan, they have what we call JIPDEC. JIPDEC is Japan's accountability agent, and they are a private entity. Korea, up and coming, okay, or rather they have already appointed, which is KISA. Okay. Same thing, this KISA is in a way a government entity that would provide certification services for CBPR. So yeah, so that's a difference here. It's Trustmark certification.
But maybe as a follow-up, you know, if an organization here has GDPR certification or the equivalent in the US, where companies are still, there's similarities, but they're not identical. So your recommendation, whether it's you, Alvin, or Dominic, I mean, what's your recommendation?
Dom, you take first, then I take.
No, you should take this. This is a great question for you.
Okay. All right. So Richard, I mean, you are in a European firm, right? And GDPR is important. And for companies out here, if you have already GDPR regime within your company, you still need to map to PDPA. Yes, GDPR is probably the world's strictest standard, and it behooves all of us to know how to comply to it. Not fully comply, but the reason why I said that is because there are new jurisdictions coming out in ASEAN, and all of them are based around the GDPR. Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines, okay, very closely based off the GDPR principles. So it makes sense for you if you are multi-footprint in the region to know this. Now, the part about, I guess your question will be, is two parts, right? If you are a European firm, you already have GDPR compliance, is that adequate that you are compliant to the PDPA? So maybe that's part one question. Part two is that if you're dealing with companies, ask you if you are PDPA compliant, how are you meeting the GDPR? It's the other way around, right? So the first one would be, you need to have a framework to compare, okay? So that's something that we do in terms of using the privacy operation lifecycle to compare the requirements. Now, so if you are already a EU company and then you have all the requisite processes, right? Then here you want to make sure that you can meet the PDPA. It should be quite simple for you, right? But it doesn't mean it's 100% one-to-one. Okay, so we have firms here who actually do 2 report cards, right? We work with firms here, the CEO here has a report card of how they comply with PDPA, and then they say my Singapore operation has this thing applicable, not necessarily compliant, applicable to the GDPR and they borrow the global principles across, right? Some of it is not applicable, like, right to forget and stuff like that. Not easily implementable because it means your whole system needs to be able to delete it all the way through, right? So that's one. The other way around, if you're a company here having to work with a EU company and they ask you, okay, so how are you compliant to our requirements based on GDPR? That's another tricky question, right? So if you don't have a framework, it's going to be very difficult to answer that question. And that's why having a framework of compliance with your report card, and then you show them, and then you can compare and contrast. So we work with both sides, both kind of firms. Yeah, hopefully that's a enough answer for your question.
I think that's really helpful. Did you want to add anything to that, Dominic?
No, I think he answered basically the question pretty well, so I wouldn't want to come and mess it up.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I think we all heard this afternoon is whether in COVID or non-COVID, there's a lot of data sharing going on. Organizer to vendor, a vendor to secondary vendor. Where does the liability lie when if I collect data and share it with a vendor and then the vendor doesn't comply? I mean, where does liability end and where does it begin?
Well, the rule of law, Dominic has mentioned earlier on, right? You can delegate the task, but you cannot delegate responsibility. First principle of the law, right? So you can have sub vendor, whatever it is. That's why I say the due diligence is very important, right? Whether you know your first vendor, and if they're going to sup it out and they don't tell you, boomerangs back to you. Yeah.
It's a very sobering thought, isn't it? As we share our data with lots of different organizations. It's quite sobering to think where the ultimate liability lies. So I think it's all sort of back to the drawing board for a number on it. We talked a little bit earlier around legitimate interest. Can you just help us understand a little bit about legitimate interest and what it means in our industry? I'll give you an example of what it means in our industry, because this is one of the big changes to the Act. If you could help the attendees this afternoon.
Okay, so you say you want to give an example, you say? Or you want me to give an example?
I'd like you to give an example, a bit more explanation what it means and an example of how we would apply this in our industry.
Okay. Yeah, so I think coming off GDPR, our legitimate interest and the GDPR legitimate interest are different. Okay, so this part here where we are talking about legitimate interest, let me get to the slide so I can share with everybody, right? Otherwise, this is for those who are a bit more informed. In Singapore, they added legitimate interest if you are for existing base. So let me just get to the right slide, right? So I don't talk out a point for you guys. Okay. And okay. Yeah. Sorry, my slides are slow. Okay, so here it's about legitimate interest for interest organization or a segment of the public, right? So to cater a situation where the systemic benefits obtaining individual consent may not be appropriate, right? So you can use it for purpose of business improvement, okay? So, and likewise, let me see in terms of lawful interest, okay? Where the benefit to the public is greater than adverse effect on the individual. So that one in GDPR is consistent, right? Okay. But if it's include detecting or preventing illegal activities such as fraud or money laundering, threats to physical safety and harm, okay, or preventing misuse of services, that's legitimate interest, right? But before you do that, right, Richard, you need to conduct assessment and balancing tests. There's a sample checklist of whether you can do that. You need to articulate individuals. You should be able to articulate to individuals what are the benefits, right? And then you need to disclose that the org is relying on this exception through your policy. So your data protection policy, which is on your website, should disclose that you may, lean on this legitimate interest, right? And provide a business contact information, right? Usually of your DPO that customers can get in touch with, right? So that is the guidelines.
Okay. Did you want to add anything to that one, Dominic?
Okay, I think for me it's very straightforward that we have, because again this is got to do with the trust mark certification, for at least in what I'm concerned with, is that we have included all these things inside the certification. So this, what Alvin has mentioned, is that yes, it is important that you list out the exceptions that you are leveraging on. Okay, make it clear. Don't say that, oh, it's in my mind, I'm basing on the law. List it out in the policies, so that at the end of the day, if there's any dispute, you can say that, look, it's inside our policy. All my staff knows about it. So just want to add on to this point is that yes, as organizations harness on the power, okay, the benefits of legitimate interest, this amended, or rather I will put it away as updated, these updates in the Act, it is important that your staff know about it. It is important that it appears in your policies, okay? And it is important that when you are using it and how you are using it, rather than waiting for something to happen and then you try to figure out, okay, how does this fit into the picture? So it's just to add on to what Alvin has mentioned earlier on. Yeah.
So let's get an opportunity for a moment. It was really encouraging to see that particular case of that forensic company getting a great contract for being compliant. Yes. Can you see that government tenders in the future will be awarded with people who are compliant? Or is that going to be a nice to have, or a critical to have, or a must have, do you think?
Okay. First of all, just to add on to that, the earlier story that I mentioned, the earlier example, they are not just the only example. In fact, we have quite a few companies that secured contracts with Google, with Amazon, because of a trust mark certification. At the end of the day, it gives you the added advantage in the digital economy. Closer to home, Government of Singapore, if you are a vendor that wishes to do business with Government of Singapore, government tender, government contracts, this is something that is becoming more and more important. Again, as we all know, with the recent major data breaches, then you have the SingHealth case and all that, and then there was this whole review of public sector data security that happened 2 years ago. Okay, so there was a review again how the government-wide approach, how do we handle personal data? And Alvin rightly pointed out that previously vendors who work for government, they were not subjected to the PDPA, but there was a change, and then now they are subjected to the PDPA, and therefore they're liable if there's a data breach. And because of this increased awareness, heightened alert, if I would use that word, sorry, I have to use it right here, right? Especially when going through a heightened alert. Government agencies tend to favor, okay, I wouldn't say favor, they would tend to request for data protection trust mark certification. But however, having said that, it is not mandatory yet. Okay, it is not mandatory yet, because we understand the industry and the sector that it would not be fair to say that, hey, overnight you need to have a trust mark certification. If not, you cannot secure this contract. So it's not fair. So as of now, the current contracts that you would see having a so-called data protection as encouraged criteria, okay, you will see it in ICT contracts mainly as of now. Okay, but more and more agencies are starting to include that in the non-ICT contracts. This is purely up to them. But given the climate now, and the importance of data protection, you will start to see this becoming more and more pervasive. You will start to see tenders and contract requirements, ITQ and ITTs asking for trust mark certification. Whether or not it becomes mandatory, I don't know. I can't tell yet. Okay, but I can safely say that where we're heading now is definitely it will give you an advantage when bidding for contracts, tenders and quotations, ITQs and ITTs in the government sector.
I think you've given us a nice hint, so that's good, and I think that's really helpful for all the people on this call. But I think even the tender aside and the trust mark aside, the data protection officer is mandatory, and having the plan is mandatory. And I suppose it may be required to present both in future dealings with government or in any contract. Okay, so a question we talked about last week. What should I be doing first? Should I be looking at my cyber policy or my customer data policy first?
Yeah, good that you bring that up, right? So this is a very common, how would I call that? Mix up in companies, both big and small, where security and data protection are mixed together. So if I just put two circles like that, okay, in Singapore vernacular, same but different. There's security circle and then data protection. Security looks at confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Just because it's security doesn't mean you have privacy or data protection. A simple example is your security cameras, right? That security guys have zero privacy, right? So you can have info security within your company, but you may not meet data protection laws because you do not know, right? And the other circle, data privacy, has notice and choice, which doesn't appear in cybersecurity or security. Where the two will meet is confidentiality, usage, and access. So that is why, just because you have sound cybersecurity or security policies doesn't mean you have met the data protection law, where you may not have the right to use the data. You may not know that those data are subject to certain consent, notice, and purpose. That doesn't appear in a cybersecurity policy, right? So, and then retention and all these kind of things. So these things really needs a treatment of its own. Now, many people do double hat, right? If you actually coming to a standards, I think somebody asking an ISO standard or whatever, right? So ISO 27000 is cybersecurity. They now have extensions to privacy as well because they know the two will meet, right? So now there's a 27701, which is the privacy management of the info security standard. Okay, so that is where the two will meet. So where do you get started? You mentioned just now. If you already have sound security policy, then you are more than halfway there to get your house in order for data protection, right? But please don't assume that you have sound security policy means you have your data protection licked. It's not, right? So having a DPO, it's important to look at that. Now, Richard, you come from the European business side of things, multinational. In GDPR, the security line cannot be the DPO because it's a conflict of interest. In this part of the world, we don't have that, right? Okay, so in GDPR, you cannot have a DPO who has a conflict of interest. They cannot be a CISO, the info security guy. They cannot be the operations guy. It has to be independent. Here, we are still having people double hatting. Okay.
Great. Another question has come through the Q&A, and I think you touched on this before, but I'll read it out. With so many compliance and regulations existing out there outside of Singapore, such as GDPR, with regard to documentation, audits, assessment policies, can a company use the same documents, policies for compliance with PDPA or with GDPR if they're applicable, or do you have to separate them for certification? But quite a complicated question, so I'll leave it to you guys.
I'm just thinking whether this question is with the certification in mind. Okay, so for us, maybe I'll just address the certification part of it. For us, we've come across companies that in the course of a Trustmark certification, CBPR certification, they share with us a policy that is written more in line with the languages of the GDPR. So that's okay. For us, we are not so particular how it's been written. What we want is, in the event that if we were to ask the DPO, okay, in terms of how are you complying with the PDPA, are you able to point that out in your policies? And if they're able to do so, then that's fine. Even if it's written in the GDPR format, so you see things like instead of personal data, they use PII, for example, and all that. But that's okay, as long as they know how they are complying with the PDPA, how they want to write it, it's really up to them. We don't dictate. And as long as they can point it out in the assessment, how they are meeting the requirements of the trust fund as well as the CBPR, that's fine. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's really fine. Yeah. So,
okay, that's fantastic. So we've got 1 minute to go. I think earlier both of you said, what's the very first thing we should do? And I think it's reflected in your slides. You've both got QR codes to download, very first next steps. But if I can just have the next slide, Sasios, we also have some suggestions for you. What we have is what's next. So, this is a tricky piece, and we've only had an hour and a half to deal with something that's incredibly important. incredibly costly from reputation and financially if we get it wrong, but very rewarding if we get it right as we deal with various contracts. So two things that, excuse me, two things that we have planned: a half-day workshop on Data Protection 101, which will be coming out soon, which we can share the dates and times, or you can use your QR code reader and the QR code on your screen. And the second thing is a half-day masterclass session. We're looking to adopt the Data Protection Trust Mark certification. So two half-day workshops, really helpful. I think one cry out to everyone on this webinar is, do have a look at these two masterclasses. Talk to people in your organization, maybe talk to your peers. I think it'd be fair to say this is very serious. It's very huge implications if we get it wrong, huge implications, but very rewarding on reputationally if we get it right. And I suppose from an industry perspective, we don't want to be seen as a rebel industry. We want to be seen as a good industry. And I think, you know, reputations can be won and lost or lost very, very quickly. So I think we don't want to be put in that difficult corner. So I think do have a look at these two things. Use your QR code reader, and I think really just the final thing to say is, look, thank you very much to Alvin. Really insightful session. Very clear what our next steps are. That's terrific. To Dominic, also, thank you for your support of this particular program, and thank you for IMDA's support of our industry. Really important. The slides will be made available, and to everyone on this call this afternoon, have a fantastic afternoon, and hope you can join us for our workshops in the future. Thank you, everybody.
Right, thanks, Richard.
Thanks, guys. I saw one last question there. We will cover that in the 101 case study. We have plenty. We have no time to go through it, but definitely quite a number of them. But I think that deserves a private discussion with, in a 101. So we're happy to walk through that with you guys from your industry. Yeah. Okay.
Anything final, Dominic, before we close today?
No, just feel free to give me a call. I'm more than happy to have a conversation with anyone. Yeah, I would ask for a coffee, but we can't do that now. So
we're gonna have a virtual coffee.
Yeah, feel free to give me a call. Drop me an email, give me a call if you want to find out more. Happy to have a word with you.
That's very, very generous, and I think our industry really appreciates that. And on behalf of Sasios, thanks, guys, for your such generous sharing this afternoon.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, Richard.